The night was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that makes every lantern flicker sound louder than it should. In the heart of the old West Town, the wooden boards of the saloon groaned as laughter and rowdy voices spilled into the street. The smell of whiskey mixed with dust, filling the cool air as lanterns swayed gently outside the weather-beaten building dot by the hitching post across from the saloon. Two sisters clung to each other. They were young, no more than in their early teens, barefoot and dirt-streaked from wandering too far under the dim glow of the moon. Their wide eyes reflected fear, and they pressed against the post as if the rough wood could shield them from the danger closing in. A shadow loomed above them. It belonged to a drunken man, staggering but purposeful, his breath sharp with whiskey. His voice was harsh, slurred, his words lost in the night air, but his posture alone was enough to tell the girls they were in danger. His hand lifted halfway, as if to remind them of his control, and in the lamplight his looming figure seemed larger than life. The girls whispered between themselves, their trembling voices almost too soft to hear. "Please, please leave us," one begged, her words breaking with fear. Her younger sister's small hands clutched tighter around her arm, her silent plea written across her face. The man chuckled low, the sound sending another shiver through the quiet. Night dot, but then, from the far end of the street, the sound of footsteps began to echo. They were slow, steady, and unshaken by the weight of silence. Dust swirled lightly with each step as a figure emerged from the shadows of the street. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and walked with a kind of purpose that belonged to someone who did not hesitate, someone who carried himself as if the earth itself bent beneath his resolve. The girls looked up, their wide eyes catching the sight of him as he came closer. A Native American warrior, his chest bare to the night, his bronze skin marked faintly by scars that spoke of a hard life endured. His long black hair flowed freely over his shoulders, lifted gently by the night breeze, shining dark under the pale light of the moon. Around his neck and arms hung tribal adornments, turquoise beads, carved bone, and silver pieces that glinted softly with each deliberate step. There was a presence about him that stilled the night. The raucous laughter from the saloon seemed to fade into nothing. Even the drunken man faltered for a moment, his hand lowering as his eyes narrowed at the warrior's approach. The girls felt it too, a sense of safety, as if the very shadow of this man could shelter them from the harm that had seemed inevitable only a moment ago. They clung to each other tighter, their breaths trembling, but their fear shifted into something else, hope. The warrior did not rush. He did not shout. He simply walked forward, his steps unbroken, his eyes locked on the scene before him. His silence carried more weight than words ever could. The drunken man straightened, as if trying to reassert his dominance, but even in his whiskey-clouded state, he sensed the danger and the calm before him. The warrior stopped only a few feet away, the lantern light catching the curve of his shoulders, the glint of his adornments, and the unyielding strength in his gaze. The girls whispered again, their words carried on shaky breaths. "Please, help us." And in that moment, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. The lanterns flickered, dust swirled, and the faint creak of the saloon doors swinging open added to the tension. Yet no sound was louder than the pounding of the girls' hearts and the steady rhythm of the warrior's calm breathing. He was a wall between them and danger, a force of stillness, of quiet power. The drunken man shifted uneasily under his gaze, and the girls, though still trembling, finally felt the first fragile thread of safety return. The warrior said nothing, not yet. His presence alone was enough to change the story unfolding in the lamplight. The saloon doors banged open, laughter spilling into the street as more men stumbled out with whiskey in their hands. The night was alive with noise now, but to the two frightened sisters huddled against the hitching post, it all faded into the background. Their world had narrowed to a single moment, the drunken man's swaying frame towering above them, and the silent figure standing just a few feet away. The warrior did not speak. He didn't need to. His dark eyes held the kind of steady fire that unsettled even the most reckless men. He stood with the quiet patience of a mountain, unmoved, unbending, his presence filling the space between danger and innocence. The drunken man finally broke the silence, his words rough and sharp. "Go on, warrior. This ain't your business. Move along." But the girls knew it was his business now. Something in the way he stood told them so. They clutched each other tighter, trembling as tears streaked their dirt-stained cheeks. Their whispers rose again, soft but desperate. "Please, don't leave us. Please." The warrior's gaze flicked to them just for a heartbeat. His features, carved and strong, softened at the sight of their fear. And that was the answer they needed. He wasn't going to walk away. He took one more step forward. The sound of his bare feet against the dusty street was strangely loud, echoing like a drumbeat. The drunken man shifted, trying to puff his chest, as if he could match the warrior's silent authority. But there was something in that gaze, unwavering, calm, and ancient, that made his bravado falter. Behind them, one of the saloon men noticed the scene. His laughter died in his throat. He tugged at his friend's sleeve, whispering sharply, "Best stay out of that. You don't want to cross him." The warrior's silence weighed heavier than steel. His long black hair caught the glow of the lanterns, and the turquoise and bone ornaments on his chest gleamed like sparks of fire. Every detail of him spoke of strength earned through battles and survival. A man who had stood against storms and would stand again tonight. The younger girl pressed her face into her sister's arm, whispering, "He's not leaving us." Her older sister, though trembling, nodded faintly. "I know." The drunken man snarled, his pride stung by the stillness of his opponent. He reached for the girls again, his hand rough and clumsy, but before he could close the space, the warrior's voice finally cut through the night dot. It was low, deep, controlled. "Enough." That single word seemed to ripple through the air. Even the saloon laughter hushed. The girls felt it vibrate in their chests. A word not shouted but weighted with something far more powerful. The drunken man froze, his hand hanging in the air. His drunkenness could not blind him to the meaning carried in that one word, a warning, a command, and a promise all at once. The warrior's gaze burned into him, unflinching, unyielding. His body was still, but his presence alone was more threatening than any raised fist or drawn weapon. The girls gasped quietly, as if breathing for the first time in minutes. For them, that single word was not just a warning to the drunken man. It was a shield. It was safety. The street had changed. What moments ago was filled with fear was now drenched in an unfamiliar kind of power, the kind that comes when someone chooses to stand where no one else dares. The drunken man stumbled backward, muttering something incoherent. He tried to hold his ground, tried to steady himself, but his swagger was gone. He was no longer the biggest presence in the street. The warrior had stripped him of that with nothing more than a gaze and a single word. The girls dared to hope. Their trembling slowed, and though they still pressed against each other, their tears no longer fell with despair, but with relief that someone had finally come. The warrior did not move closer, not yet. He simply held the line, his silence and stillness a wall stronger than stone. He had entered their story, and with his presence, everything had changed. The sisters did not know his name. They did not know his past. But they knew, deep within their young hearts, that this man had chosen to protect them. And as the drunken man muttered curses under his breath, retreating a step, the girls leaned into each other and whispered again, this time not begging, but in awe. "He's not afraid." The dusty street held its silence as if caught between two heartbeats. The drunken man's smirk faltered, though his swagger remained. He looked the warrior up and down, sneering at the bare chest, the tribal adornments, and the calm that cloaked him like armor. "You think you can scare me?" The man slurred, his hand twitching as though eager to prove himself. "These two ain't your concern. Walk on." But the warrior did not walk on. He stopped just a few feet from the girls, his tall frame casting a shadow that wrapped over them like a shield. His long black hair swayed in the desert breeze, turquoise and bone glinting against bronzed skin. His eyes, dark and steady, didn't blink. They locked on the man with a focus that made the air grow heavy. He spoke at last, his voice calm yet firm, carrying in the quiet like a drumbeat in the night. "They asked you to leave them," the warrior said, each word deliberate. "Now I ask." The man laughed, but his laugh came brittle, breaking too quickly. His shoulders shifted nervously, though he tried to disguise it with bravado. "You think your pretty words mean something? These streets don't belong to you." He marked, spitting into the dust. The warrior tilted his head slightly, unshaken. "Streets belong to no man, but every heart here beats beneath the same sky, and no heart should tremble in fear." His words wrapped the night like an invisible cord, pulling even the air tighter. The two sisters clung to one another there, breathing shallow, their eyes fixed on the man who had come for them. The drunk wavered, confusion mixing with his bravado. He expected anger, fists, or the flash of steel. Instead, he faced a storm of stillness, the kind of stillness that spoke of rivers, cutting canyons and mountains standing eternal. One of the girls, her voice small and quivering, whispered, "Don't leave us." The warrior turned his gaze briefly toward them, and something softened in his eyes. Not weakness, but a deep, unspoken vow. He placed a hand gently against the hitching post near them, grounding them in his presence. "I will not leave," he said, his tone carrying the weight of a promise carved in stone. The drunk scoffed, louder this time, as if to drown out the unease rising in him. Big words for a man standing alone. But the warrior shook his head. A man is never alone when he stands for what is right. The tension pressed harder, as though the lantern light itself hesitated to flicker. The girls dared to breathe. Again, hiding partly behind the warrior's frame, their fear now mingled with a fragile thread of hope. For the first time that night, the drunk looked away, his confidence cracking beneath the calm, unwavering strength before him. The weight of the warrior's presence did not come from fists or fury. It came from something deeper, something unshakable. The silence stretched, and in that silence, the girls realized something they had not felt in hours: safety. The warrior did not move closer, nor did he need to. His word had been spoken, and in the Old West, where men fought for gold, land, and pride, there was something rare, something sacred about a word that held firm as iron. The girls leaned into each other, eyes shining with the reflection of lantern light, watching the man who had stepped into their nightmare and begun to turn it into something else, not yet a dream, but perhaps the beginning of one. And though the night was not finished, though the street still smelled of whiskey and dust, the balance had shifted. For the first time, it was no longer the cruel man who held power. It was the quiet warrior whose word was more unshakable than the town's wooden beams. The Old West, unforgiving and often lawless, had just witnessed a law written without ink, without badge, without gunpowder, a law etched in courage. And the girls, still trembling, knew they had not only been seen, but believed. The town had gone so quiet that even the horses tethered to the posts seemed to still their restless hooves. The saloon's music, once raucous, had faltered, drifting into silence as the piano player froze mid-note. Through cracked shutters and half-open doors, faces peeked out: the shopkeeper's wife, the old blacksmith, The boy who swept the boardwalks, every eye fixed on the same scene. A shirtless warrior standing unflinching in the middle of the street, his long black hair glinting with silver strands of moonlight, his chest bare but adorned with turquoise, bone, and silver tribal jewelry. His frame carried not only muscle, but something greater, the weight of a man who would not bend. And beside him, pressed against the wooden post, two frightened girls clung to one another, their thin shoulders trembling. The drunken man, red-faced and staggering, still tried to hold on to his swagger. "Don't stare at me like you're some kind of savior," he growled at the warrior, his voice louder now as if to mask the cracks in his courage. "This is none of your business. No one here's going to stop me." The words rang out, echoing off the wooden buildings. But where once there might have been chuckles or murmurs of agreement, now there was only silence. The townsfolk did not step forward, but neither did they laugh. They watched. The warrior's gaze never wavered. His voice, when it came, was calm, deep, steady, the kind of voice that cut sharper than any blade. "It became my business when fear touched their eyes," he said. A murmur stirred in the crowd. Some heads tilted. A mother pulled her child closer to her skirts, whispering something soft. The drunk spat into the dirt, his boots shifting uneasily. His hand twitched near his belt, though no weapon glinted there, only the threat of cruelty and arrogance. "You think the people of this town care what you say?" he shouted, gesturing at the buildings. "They'll let me do as I please. They always have." The warrior let his eyes sweep briefly toward the shadows where the townsfolk stood. He saw their hesitation, their fear, their shame, and he gave them no judgment, only truth. A town that stands by while the innocent tremble is no better than the one who causes their fear, he said, his voice carrying into every window, every doorway. The words hit like stones on still water, rippling outward. People shifted, glancing at one another. No one moved to help, but no one moved away either. The two sisters pressed closer, and one of them, the younger, her voice barely more than a breath, whispered, "He's not afraid." The warrior heard her, and though he did not turn, something in his stance seemed to strengthen, as though the fragile trust of a child had become a shield upon his back. The drunk's bravado wavered. He looked around, expecting laughter, support, even indifference. But the town, for once, gave him none. They weren't stepping in, not yet, but their silence was no longer in his favor. His eyes narrowed at the warrior. "One man can't change this street," he snarled. The warrior's lips curved, not in amusement, but in something steadier, almost like sorrow. "One man's courage can light the fire that makes shadows run," he answered. The girls clung tighter to each other. The air thickened again. The town seemed to lean forward, every soul caught between fear and awakening. For the first time in years, perhaps the dusty Main Street did not belong to cruelty. It belonged to a man who carried no badge, who bore no gun, but whose word was law because it rang with truth. And in that moment, every onlooker understood something they had long forgotten. A man's worth was not measured by what he took, but by what he stood for. The night was far from over, but the shift had begun. The drunk man's swagger faltered, but rage kept his feet moving. His boots dragged through the dust, heavy, uneven, as he closed the distance between himself and the warrior. The air carried the stink of whiskey with him, sour and hot, like poison leaking into the night. The warrior didn't move. He stood in the moonlight as if carved from the very earth, chest bare, his jewelry catching a faint glow, his long black hair swaying with the breeze. His calm presence only seemed to fuel the drunk's fury. "You think you can shame me in front of them?" The man slurred, his words breaking, loud enough for the crowd hiding in doorways to hear. "You think they'll respect you more then?" "At me?" The townsfolk watched, breathless, no one daring to interrupt. For years, men like the drunk had strutted these streets unchecked. For years, fear had been the currency of the town. But tonight felt different. Tonight, someone stood tall, enough to cut through the rot. The warrior tilted his head, his dark eyes steady. His voice was low, but it carried, firm and unbroken. Respect is not taken by fear. It is given when a man stands in truth. The drunk sneered, his hands curled into fists. With a sudden, violent swing, he lunged. The crowd gasped as his arm cut through the air, aiming for the warrior's face. But the blow never landed. In a fluid motion, faster than the eye could follow, the warrior stepped aside. His hand rose, calm yet unyielding, catching the man's wrist mid-strike. The impact jolted through the street, not a sound of violence, but of power restrained. The drunk stumbled, shocked by the ease with which his strength was stopped. The warrior's grip tightened, not cruel, but immovable. His voice rumbled like distant thunder. Enough. The girls flinched, then peered up, wide-eyed. They had expected blood, but instead they saw control, mastery. The warrior was not like the others who fought in anger. His strength was guided, measured. The drunk growled and tried again, swinging with his other fist. The warrior shifted, blocking the strike with his forearm, his body moving like water, soft where it needed to bend, steel where it needed to stand. A murmur rose in the watching crowd. Some leaned forward, others gripped door frames with white knuckles. They weren't seeing a brawl. They were seeing a lesson. The drunk panted, sweat mixing with the liquor that clung to him. His bravado cracked. You think you're better than me?" He spat. The warrior's expression didn't change. He loosened his grip just enough for the man to pull back, then spoke. "Better? No? Stronger? Perhaps. But I do not need to be better than you. I need only protect those who beg for mercy." The words cut deeper than any fist. The drunk froze, his breath catching, his eyes darting toward the two trembling sisters who clung to each other. For the first time, he seemed to see them, not as prey, not as possessions, but as frightened souls. But pride is a stubborn poison. His face twisted, rage surging again. He roared, throwing himself at the warrior with all the clumsy force of desperation. And still, the warrior did not strike back. He moved with precision, redirecting, deflecting, until the man collapsed to his knees in the dirt, panting and broken. The town exhaled as one. Silence hung, heavier than before, but now laced with awe. They had seen strength, not the strength of fists, but the strength of restraint. The warrior stood over the drunk, his chest rising and falling steady, his gaze sharp as flint. "This ends tonight," he said, his voice carrying across every window and porch. "Fear will not own these streets. Not while I draw breath." The girls' tears slowed. They looked up at him as though he were more than a man, as though the ground itself had risen to defend them. And for the first time in years, the town felt the stirrings of something they had forgotten: hope. The drunk man crumpled in the dust, his chest heaving, his pride shattered before the eyes of the town. For a long, brittle moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the ragged breaths of the defeated and the slow, steady rhythm of the warriors' own breathing. The lantern light flickered across faces hidden in the shadows of doorways. Men who once boasted loudly in saloons now stood silent, their hats pulled low. Women pressed children back against their skirts, hearts thundering in their chests. They had seen men fight before, bar brawls, gun duels, blood spilled like water. But never had they seen a man like this warrior. He had won without cruelty. He had defended without taking. He had faced violence with calm, as though he carried the weight of something greater than himself. The girls trembled, clutching each other, their wide eyes never leaving him. One whispered, her voice breaking in awe, "He didn't even hit." Him? The warrior stood tall, shoulders broad beneath the moonlight, his long black hair swaying in the night air. His turquoise and bone jewelry glinted as though it carried the fire of the stars. He looked not at the fallen drunk, but at the people watching. "This town has forgotten its strength," he said, his deep voice rolling across the silence like distant thunder. "You have let fear rule. You have turned your eyes away when the helpless cried. Tonight, you saw two sisters beg for mercy, and you hid." The words struck harder than fists. Heads bowed. Shame crept into the crowd like a cold fog. From somewhere in the back, a child's voice pierced the silence. "Mama, he's brave." The warrior's gaze swept across them, unflinching. His eyes were dark but not cruel, steady but not condemning. "One man's cruelty has held you quiet. One man's fists have owned your nights. But no man owns your spirit unless you let him." A murmur stirred, not defiance, not yet, but something small, something restless. A seed breaking the Z. Soil. Then it happened. An old man stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane. His frame was frail, his voice quivered, but when he spoke, the whole town heard. "He's right," the elder rasped. "We've been cowards. We've let fear choke us." The crowd shifted uneasily. Another voice rose, stronger. "A woman this time," clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders. "I watched him, this stranger, stand for our children when none of us did. What does that make us?" The murmurs grew louder, swelling like the first crack of a storm. Eyes turned toward the warrior, then to the sisters, then back to the drunk still groaning in the dirt. For the first time in years, men and women looked at each other and did not see helpless neighbors. They saw fellow townsfolk who had suffered. The same silence, the same fear. The drunk groaned, trying to push himself up, but no one moved to help him. Where once the crowd might have rushed to appease him, now they stood still, their faces hardened. The warrior's gaze shifted to the fade, stayed to their faces hardened. Girls. He crouched to their level, his movements slow and gentle, his powerful frame folding like a mountain bowing. His hand hovered above them, not touching, just close enough for them to feel the promise of safety. "You are safe," he told them softly, "not because I am here, but because you are not alone." The sisters clung tighter, their tears slowing. One nodded, her small voice whispering, "Thank you." The crowd grew quiet again, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of awakening. The warrior rose to his full height once more, his shadow stretching long across the dirt street. His voice carried, low but unwavering, "You do not need me to fight your battles. You only need to remember you were never powerless." The old man tapped his cane against the wood of the boardwalk, steady and sharp. "No more silence," he said firmly, and just like that, the first ripple became a wave. Others joined, voices rising, whispers turning to shouts, women calling out, men nodding, fists clenching not in fear but in resolve. The warrior had not only defended two girls, he had lit a fire in the hearts of the whole town. The drunk man staggered to his feet at last, his pride bleeding more than his body. His eyes darted across the crowd, searching for the obedience he had always commanded, the lowered gazes, the bowed heads. But tonight he found none. Men who once avoided his stare now met it head on. Women no longer shrank behind doorways. Even the children leaned forward, wide-eyed, watching as if waiting for justice itself to fall. "You'll regret this," the drunk spat, but the words cracked, brittle as dry wood. He swayed, his threats carrying no weight in the thick air of change. The old man's cane struck the boardwalk again. "No," he said firmly, "we've regretted our silence long enough." Others echoed him, voices rising like a tide. "No more. Not in this town. Never again." The drunk backed away, stumbling, his hands shaking. The crowd had turned, and he knew it. For the first time in years, he was not feared. He was alone. The warrior did not move toward him. He simply stood, tall and still, his chest rising and falling like the steady beat of a drum. His long black hair shimmered in the lantern glow, his turquoise and bone jewelry catching the light like sparks of fire. He had already won. Not the fight in the dirt, but the fight in their hearts. The drunk cursed under his breath and staggered into the dark, swallowed by the night. No one followed. No one bowed to him. His reign had ended, not with a gun, not with blood, but with courage. Silence lingered. Then, slowly, the townsfolk turned toward the warrior. Dozens of eyes met his, and in each one was something different now: respect, gratitude, even reverence. The two sisters stepped forward, their tiny hands gripping each other tightly. The older one, her voice trembling but determined, spoke loud enough for all to hear. "You saved us." The warrior's expression softened. He crouched once more, lowering himself so his eyes met theirs. "No," he said gently. "You saved yourselves by standing. Tonight you found your voices. Do not lose them again." The girls blinked up at him, the truth of his words sinking deeper than they understood. They only knew that they felt stronger now than they ever had before. A hush fell again as the warrior straightened. His shadow stretched long across the square, mingling with the flicker of lanterns and the glow of starlight. For a heartbeat, it seemed he belonged not to the world of men, but to the stories whispered around campfires, a figure carved from legend, born to remind the living of their own strength. The old man raised his hat in silent respect. The woman with the shawl pressed a hand to her heart. One by one, others followed. Hats lifted, heads bowed, voices murmuring words of thanks. The warrior gave no bow, no speech. He only gave them silence, a silence heavy with meaning, heavy with the promise that they would remember this night. Then, without another word, he turned. His boots pressed softly into the dirt as he walked away, the jewelry on his chest catching the last glow of lantern light. His hair flowed in the cool night wind, and with each step it seemed the world grew quieter behind him. The sisters ran a few paces after him, but stopped at the edge of the square. They watched as his figure grew smaller, fading into the darkness beyond the last building, until only the rhythm of his footsteps echoed, steady, unyielding, like a drumbeat leading into eternity. The town stood still for a long while. Then, at last, the old man's voice broke the silence. "Tonight, we found our strength again, and it wasn't him alone, it was all of us." The people nodded, some with tears, some with clenched jaws, but all with a fire burning behind their eyes. The warrior was gone, but the town was no longer the same. They had been given more than rescue. They had been given themselves, and somewhere beyond the horizon, under the endless sky, the warrior walked on, a solitary figure, carrying no trophies, no praise, only the quiet certainty that his purpose was never to stay, but to awaken. A man, a protector, a legend.